So 1 more minute. Okay, so let's start. Thank you again for joining my summer webinar about Anacredit here. And I hope that in the next 45 minutes I can give you insights that I had won over the past 4 years regarding this highly interesting and quite, let's say, challenging regulation. I put my spot on certain areas. Of course, in 45 minutes, you cannot highlight everything. So I just wanted to give you my caveats for Anacredit. That means really the areas where you have to put your attention to and where you really should look that you have or your bases covered to get around the difficulties and the traps that are hidden there. My guest today is Leo Steinrex. He is a highly appreciated specialist, also working for VERMEG Germany, and he did, especially in the Anacredit field, several interesting things. Leo, you can say something to yourself.
Yes, hello, I'm Leo Steinrex. I joined VERMEG at the beginning of the year. As a background, I've worked as a consultant in regulatory for the last couple of years. I have worked at most major banks, but also smaller retail banks. The last 2.5 years, I've been more or less exclusively dealing with Anacredit, and I will add a few real-life examples from my past working experience to highlight a few of the cases that Ralph will present with regards to the quality and also the data handling of Anacredit.
Okay. So thanks for this, Leo. I think that here the Anacredit was a game changer not too long ago. The regulation came up with 2016 with a lot of so-called technical reviews and laws, but it was not before 2018 where the first reports had to be filed. But then it came with a lot of challenges. We saw that first of all, due to the regulation itself, it was for the first time where it was expected to send high volumes of data to the regulators, especially for the institutes with a high volume of credits. And the interesting thing was that not only high volumes, but also high granularity of data was delivered. So as well, next to these data points, there was also a complex validations within the field. There were, as alone in the handbook, I think more than 120 pages full of, let's say, most interesting data validations and lists and difficult areas to ship around. We come to that a little bit later. Then, of course, Anacredit felt due to all this new kind of structure more like an application than a reporting, because especially here we have no real templates in the classical sense, but only data descriptions and descriptions of data relations. And of course, then it was all about sending the right data with the right volumes. That means, for example, not only simply data for the end of one period, but also data over a period with, let's say, hundreds and thousands and even sometimes millions of data rows. Yeah, some developments caused new problems. That was when the regulator thought, okay, we need not to have all these high volumes every month, so let's just please send us the deltas. So of course the applications needed to of course, compare that what has been sent the month before. And so that brought up new problems, especially towards certain areas where, for example, data, when would the data start to be reported? So you have not only the delta towards the status of a position the month before, but also status of new created positions. So that was quite, let's say that brought to new problems in the application itself. Especially, I can remember a case in Germany, then suddenly you had to send, not only when you had some mistakes in your report, you did not only have to send the deltas for that actual month, but also from the past 6 reporting values, reporting periods. So that was also quite something that, let's say, not only raised eyebrows, but also led to a lot of additional work. And here we had also, when we saw then these large volumes, of course, the problem was then what do I do with data when I have, for example, hundreds of thousands of positions that I need to correct for certain areas, or how do I need to correct subsets of these hundreds of thousands of lines? So all these things challenged really, not only the IT, challenged everybody. And because it was a new field and it was kind of a new kind of area that you had to address. So all these things together, of course, came in a time where everybody was anyway, and in a lot of, let's say, challenges in a time where everybody said we have too much regulation, we have too much statistics. The Anacredit even was the first statistical reporting, by the way. It was not supervision reporting. So the CoRep, FinRep, everybody knows, okay, this is the biggest part of the European regulation, but Anacredit tried to be in the charts #1 of the cumbersome and difficult reports. Okay, so that then also in the last point, I remember that, of course, every 2 or 3 months, the regulators then had to change some things. And that led again also at the vendor side, of course, to a lot of challenging release plans. So you could only plan something for the next 6 months, and then you could know that in this period of the 6 months even, there was already one or new other changes coming, and that has not stopped yet. That means really we have basically 2 or 3 significant changes of Anacredit each year. And that is something that, that is something that comes on top of all of that. Of course, some things needed to be changed, some things needed to be addressed and improved. And the hope of the regulators in Europe is very clearly that due to Anacredit, this is a kind of a new blueprint for the future reporting of all areas, and also thanks to the experiences and maybe also the improving laws and validations and rules, there might be a hope that it can be unified better, and it can be also, in the end, be better for everybody. Right now, this is not really visible. I know that a lot of banks are complaining with the regulators, and I speak with, for example, the Luxembourgish, English, and also the German and the European regulators, so they are all aware of that. Of course, these people are very close to their to that what is happening every month or every quarter around the significant reporting dates. And right now, I just can say there is a lot of movement going on. Yes, so it stays very interesting, the whole area. For me as a specialist for European regulation, I can say this is not a boring job, and it's not about boring figures. Okay, so let's dive a little bit into the parts where I think we can put some lights upon, yes, my first thought was, when you see Anacredit is a so-called DPM regulation. That means data point model. So what does that mean? You have just a long list of fields that are very well explained and declared. And these long list of data are the relevant data that should be transferred in some form to the regulator. And this form right now we have basically 4 different submission, so-called submission collections of data, all out of this data point model. But what it really means is you have not only a long list of fields, but also, of course, these fields actually are represented in a more comprehensive list of tables that have a data point relationship. I don't know if some of you might know this, but in a normal data model of a database, you have tables, and these tables have through different key fields a relationship. That means, for example, when you have a client and you have an order, then this one client can have 10 orders. So that means it's an end-to-end relationships, because 3 clients, they can have 10 orders and so on. So this kind of, let's say, complexity is hidden a little bit. So therefore, I said here, it's a data model in the Anacredit logic, as well as there is a data point model. But that means simply, that's just not a contradiction, but it means simply that you have a data point model which explains each field. And then you have also a data model in several tables. I think it's 10 at the moment. So these tables, you represent all the kind of data that are to be found for this data point model. So what you report is always a subset of the data point model within 4 different lists. Okay, so that is actually basically what they do. But the complexity, of course, is here a little bit hidden. First of all, it's changing permanently, so you also have to adapt all your systems towards it. And also, of course, it's a sourcing challenge, because some of the fields, and that was also a new thing, some of the fields are not available from normal operations. So Anacredit introduced new areas of, for example, static data that were not created before, and that had to be put in somehow. So this is, I will mention that in the next chapter, but this is also, of course, regarding the data approach, a challenge, because you don't get all the data from your operational data, so you have to put in some extra effort here.
To illustrate that complexity a little, I would like to talk about a little case that I had at a major German bank, which is producing a rather big Anacredit.
Yes.
There we had a little accident where, due to some change in the delivery systems, all of a sudden the securitizations were not clearly flagged anymore. So we couldn't clearly distinguish which securitization was belonging to which instrument. And then, of course, we had the idea, okay, let's use Anacredit to basically trace back what securitization belongs to which instrument, because we, of course, had the problem that in other reports we need to avoid over-securitization, for example, for the million reports. So in the end, we were now looking through this data tree, and it turned out that we had customers that were providing a security for, let's say, 10 different customers, but at the same time, the security was provided by a variety of other entities who were like combining their resources to provide the security. And in the end, we ended up indeed with end-to-end relations. So we needed to make a model that basically calculated this over-securitization by just assigning percentage values where they were appropriate, because they couldn't be clearly identified, which is where we had grossly underestimated the complexity of the Anacredit data model. And in the end, it turned out to be a quite costly 4 weeks project to, well, basically make the equation that would assign these appropriate values. So it might look simple on the outside, but quite confusing things can arise from it.
Thank you for that insight, Leo. Of course, he has tons of interesting stories about that. So from my first lesson here was understand what is the real difference between how the data are thought to have a relationship with, that means the data model, and what is simply stand against as this DPM. That means it is a data point model is never a data model, and that's something that you should understand here, and that is important for the further problems that we meet. Okay, so because right now when I go to the basic data input, that's the next theme. That means you have now something where you have to put data in, so you have to collect data, and these basic data quality checks is the next thing where we have to put our attention to, and this is the bad data input. It is very often the case that in regulation you think just, okay, I have data, I put them in, and then I have validations implemented, and these validations check the quality of my data, full stop. Of course, it is not like this, because in the end, when you look at your report, you try to figure out why the reported result or the result in the report is not what you expected to be. And this is something that is basically very often two very simple facts. You know, for example, maybe a certain part of a certain input table was empty unintentionally, but it is not detected because the values are zero, and so everything is collected and calculated, and in the end you have to drill down until the very start, and then you see, okay, yeah, there was maybe some errors here from the feed, not detected.
So provide a simple example for these simple errors with the null fields again. So I was working at a client with an international retail bank, and we were wondering because we were receiving error codes which were not making sense, because they didn't belong to any instruments that we had deemed to send out. So in the end, it turned out that that the input had been null for a variety of these fields, which led due to a shift in the assigned input data that we had sent out empty Anacredit reports for 3 months. Of course, since the Delta times, the Bundesbank doesn't care anymore. They basically think that you didn't make any changes, so they just keep sending you the old error reports that you have stored. Meanwhile, the bank on the receiving side was under the impression that they were receiving error reports, so they were still sending out data. And long story short, due to a simple mistake, the bank had sent out empty data reports for 3 months without noticing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And when we see here what is needed, that is the second thing, is when you onboard data, please be sure that your ETL really establishes data checks before the normal validation kicks in. That means really data checks that check against empty and null fields, unwanted double values, and even more. You can always do that when onboarding or staging data. You know, so it depends, of course, on the solution that you choose, but this is something that you should address, because it will cost you a lot more if these errors are not detected and you have to find them later. So my lesson here is very clearly avoid unnecessary late detection. Be very alert from the very moment data enter your system. Okay. Okay, let's come to the next point. That will be the data management. I write here, before you begin, make a data management plan. What does that mean? You say, okay, data management we do anyway, but in the case of that, what I mentioned before, you have some static data fields that are not usually part of the back office data, and you have to put them in and you have to keep them there. It means you need tools to store and keep data up to date. So, I mean, apart from the fact that a lot of banks keep still data in Excel sheets and stuff, we know that all, and this is our reality. It's still, of course, you have some household tools, or you have, of course, also companies and vendors who deliver tools and advice for these things. Okay, of course, we do that as well, but this is something that you simply should, as an responsible for your own data, you should simply know that you have here an area in Anacredit that you have in hardly any other area of regulation that you need to really have an own little data store to keep and to look for. Okay. So that led, of course, also to some discussions. I had always also some very reluctant clients who said, okay, you know, we don't normally, a reporting tool is a reporting tool and not a data storage. So we should really think about this. But of course, the regulator has not really, let's say, has not really thought about this. Of course not, because he's not responsible to deliver the data. So this is something that were not yet a clear answer has been found for that. Yeah. Because I know as many tools who help the client with a simple little table where you can put in data, but in the end, you need to, of course, have a very clear concept for your data onboarding and your data management. So this is here something where the IT guys and the IT parts of a company are challenged. Especially for smaller banks, it might be an issue because they don't have dedicated software development resources, of course, and they don't intend to build that up just for one application, of course. So this is something that where a lot of, let's say, workarounds and little helpers are on the way. And of course, the more manual work is connected, the more this is very clearly a source of errors, of course. You know, so I mean, I just have to. I don't have to tell you that, but everybody knows that data errors start then when, for example, a name plus an empty space is not exactly the same like a name without an empty space behind it. So even these kind of things make produce errors and make problems.
In the practical case, I think the record-breaking client who I was ever engaged had like 85 workarounds because they'd been sitting on legacy systems, which they didn't really felt compelled to upgrade. And in the end, then one workaround led to another, which basically means that whenever there was a new reporting software release or whenever there was a major change in the way the data tables operated, we had to do a regression test for 85 individual workarounds, which usually then pushed the testing time from where it would usually have been like 1 to 2 days to up to 6 weeks. Or then sometimes, of course, the risk had to be taken over by the head of regulatory. And all in all, I think in the end, it cost the bank a lot more than a simple pooling solution would have been.
Yeah. So my lesson would here be data management plan should be at least, let's say, an independent own data source information document where you really keep up to date, where your golden source of every data that go into Anacredit is located, including the ones that you keep only in lists or in Microsoft Access or in whatever kind of data tool you choose to have. And be aware that also, of course, the validations and the changes coming from the regulator regarding these fields are, of course, of the highest attention, because it is like a domino chain of events that can cause them trouble. Okay. So the next big point is the validation itself. You know, so the regulatory checks, that's quite an interesting fact. We have, of course, a lot of normal correctness and completeness checks that fulfill just like any other validation check of the regulator. The simple task of getting the right code, getting the right format of whatever date fields or banking codes, industry codes, the so-called NACE codes, and so on, or the ISINs or the LEIs, whatever is correctly formatted. I think this is, let's say, Legion. This is just the normal business as usual. Where it gets really interesting is more or less the checks where, for example, for certain investment vehicles and also, of course, so-called credit-triggered fields will be checked against more or less areas of where they can be assigned to. So kind of, for example, counterparty groups, or for example, different groups of issuers and these issuer instruments, especially when you speak of derivatives and so on. So everything that has kind of a hierarchical structure, be it the product, be it the counterparty, be it the own kind of structural categorizations for all these positions come into place. That means whenever you need to compare something, you must always see, is this a bucket of a category, and do I have all the elements that need to be in that bucket, or is any attribute missing? And that's where the validations get really, really cumbersome. You can also say a lot of things when I see realizations of certain solutions that try to mark these different validations. And especially as an IT guy, I can say that I have, let's say, seen really difficult and very complicated expressions because of the fact that here, for example, you have columns and rows at the same time to be checked. That means really you have to check certain different forms or instances of a value in a column versus other instances of another value against this. That means that you have always the product of both different values against it. So that means when you have kind of an if then else, you get not only 2 or 3, but you get like 12, 14, 15, 16 different if then else areas. So that means that this complexity already is not to be really understood when you not simply not only write it down, but only you have to deconstruct it correctly. And this is, let's say, there is where really the sophisticated solutions begin, where you need to have sophisticated professionals who really can deconstruct some of these areas, because otherwise, and I think everybody knows this, the database performance goes really down, because suddenly you have, for example, 3 tables involved. One table has maybe 5 million rows, the other table has maybe just 100 rows, but then it is a product of both. So immediately you come into the billions of possibilities when you run each field against each validation. And I think Leo can also tell stories about banks who waited for hours and hours, even a day, for a calculation to come back, Leo.
Yes, basically the rule was for the bigger banks that they would start up the calculations on Friday. Then they would run over the weekend. Usually one person had the short end of the stick and they were the retainer to see if something went wrong, which often happened. So usually then there was no buffer, because often the reports were due on Monday, or at least had to be controlled on Monday. And well, let's say around 20% of the time this simply didn't work. So there was a lot of stress, there were a lot of additional costs, and reducing this complexity helps. That's the one thing I would like to add. And the second one is, for the follow-up point, the validation checks, they always have a limited set of rules, but what they usually do not do is judge the functional correctness of the inputs that you provide. So for example, one of my previous clients had problems meeting the requirements for country codes as an input. So there's, as most of you are probably aware, there's a list by the ECB, which is published, which allows a couple of different identifiers for each country. And sadly for the German clients, they were, due to the nature of their database, not able to produce these identifiers. So in the end, they decided, okay, we are going with a different identifier. The only problem was the only way to make this identifier pass the validation rules was to check for other countries in the validation rule itself. So in the end, it was then entered as other country. The validation rule went over it. It passed. It was fine. The report went in. However, a couple of months later, the validation rules were extended. the set of rules was increased, and all of a sudden they were checking the country code against the identifier that was entered. And basically around 3,000 entries became invalid. The bank had to pay a lot of money to an outside company that had to provide these data. So they had purchased them at a very short amount of time and at a significant premium, and lost a lot of money. Why? Because they said, okay, we are abiding by all the validation rules, but they did not pay a lot of attention to the correctness of the inputs overall. So this is something that the validation rules will not cover, and it's quite short-sighted to rely on those to basically vouch for your data quality.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. It's for me again. Maybe, you know, it is, of course, it pays to really check and see if the validation itself are implemented in such a way that they can scale volumes and complexity. That means simply, first of all, you don't have to, you know, have a simple platform, but for example, it should be the state of the art, and it should be also able to be, for example, any application that is able to run in the cloud and run on such platforms is, of course, already destined to be better than anything else. You know, that means right now modern architecture of IT applications say that you need to have a certain capacity to parallel any kind of processes. You know, that's always helping to have a good performance of your data. I mean, for example, we as VERMEG, we have a lot of these challenges as some of our clients process millions in the tens of millions data every day, and we need it very early in our development process to address these kind of activities so that we have that kind of architecture. But nevertheless, it is a daily challenge, and it's, of course, it's a kind of a quality check for yourself to see that you have these bases covered. You know, so you can even have right now maybe a very relaxed schedule, saying, okay, I just have a handful of positions to report. But on the other hand, if you have more, if suddenly due to a change of a business model, or due to a change of business area, or due to a change of merging with another bank or so, you might end up suddenly in having very difficult Anacredit reports, because suddenly your volume starts being from in the hundreds to in the thousands, and in 1, 2, 3, you have suddenly a performance problem, and then you need to know where to go or where to look to understand that. Okay. So I will go to the next point. This is the last one for today. That's the submission. The submission is also an interesting theme, because actually not only because of the big submission files in the beginning, the regulator started to say, okay, we only want the delta reports, because the submission files grew simply too big. You know, so they had then problems to you know, get the right sizes and to digest all these kind of volumes. You know, then the second thing was also that is maybe not clear to everyone. Of course, XBRL is a special form of XML, but nevertheless, the regulator lets or permits two different forms here, XML and XBRL formats. And that is not exactly standardized. And as we know that all the regulators, that is the so-called typical country flavor of a European regulation. Anacredit as a European regulation has, especially here, a lot of differences. I know this especially because I work in different countries, and I did that also for a lot of different clients. And so I can say it looks different in Luxembourg, in Belgium, in France, in Germany, in England, and in Ireland. So everybody has its own little flavor and header descriptions, and also XBRL things. Especially, for example, I can say in Luxembourg, because Luxembourg you have this fund hub. Luxembourg is the biggest distributor of fund products in the world, especially cross-border. That means that they have in their Anacredit reports tons of fund positions, investment fund positions, and all different kinds of, yet you can even imagine any kind of instrument that ever existed on this planet appears in some of the thousands of funds in Luxembourg. So there you have really one of the most difficult rules set against all these different positions in Luxembourg, and especially then when you have these XBRL formats, they say, okay, you must XBRL, because then the XBRL checker, by the way, VERMEG offers free to use XBRL online service, which I find it's a genius service. And this is something that is absolutely needed. And the Luxembourgish Anacredit is said to be the most complex. I think Leo, you can confirm that.
Yes, actually, I can. All the colleagues that worked with the German Anacredit and thought it was complex, they got schooled when they had to work at the BCL. So
yes. So I can now sum it all up a little bit, and I want to wrap up my idea for today. The idea was to simply shed some light on some of the things that came along with Anacredit, and especially that might, go with you a little bit longer. That whenever you have a problem, of course, you can always ask us as your reliable partner on the market. We have let's say the knowledge and the experience, even if it's just over the last 5 years. But believe me, I have worked with so many data complexities, but the Anacredit was also for me something new in its volume and complexity overall. This is especially true when I spoke with the Anacredit specialist from the European Central Bank, very nice man called Serdar Somunc. He's I don't know exactly his name, maybe I spelled it wrong, but he is from Croatia. And he is a guy who really said that he had in the beginning a team of 20 specialists, really data scientists, and a budget. And within the first 6 months, he had to stock up his budget for 30%, because he said that was sheerly because they needed to build up large databases to digest all the data coming from all the European banks, first of all. And then they needed to, of course, also build a giant machine that validates all these data. So they have really the biggest challenge of all, because they just gather everything from all the different central banks in Europe and then try to make one big picture of it. Because when we really see what was the real purpose behind the whole thing, was not exactly about the credit data in Europe. It was actually, they thought, or maybe they still think that they say, okay, we have here an area of regulation that could be a blueprint for the future of regulation per se. Yeah. So that means, and this is, I can confirm that right now, all the central banks in Europe look into the same way. They want to revolutionize, and they want to change again the regulatory data reporting for Europe for good in the next couple of years. And Anacredit is the blueprint for it. So they wanted to say, okay, let's develop Anacredit. Let's maybe, get all the children's diseases out of it in the first 5 to 6 years. And then we have something that is maybe good enough to make our regulatory reporting easier and maybe much more stronger for the years to come. So that is actually the background. And of course, be it how it is, and all the banks feel like guinea pigs. In fact, they are. So in fact, of course, this is a big experiment, and let's say the challenges show it every day. I know still. I think there's not one bank really that is 100% happy with the outcomes, with the complaints of the banks, with the complaints of the people, with the complaints of everybody involved in that reporting. And yeah, it is, let's say, a journey where we try to accompany you and not leave you alone with all these challenges. So we, as a vendor, of course, we have to face the same things, and we try to find the best, most performant, and most sophisticated and future-proof solutions for you. Okay. In the whole, I think I would like to thank my guest Leo, and I would like to encourage you to send me your feedback and your questions that I can answer for you. Leo as well, of course, and thank you for today.